Good day, everyone. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and I want to welcome you to today's program, To Infinity and Beyond, Transforming the Customer Experience Without Limits with Low Code. Before we get started, I have a couple of brief announcements. First, today's program will be followed by a live Q&A. At any time during today's session, you can ask a question from the Questions tab of your control panel, and we'll get to as many as time allows. Second, the webinar is being recorded for on-demand playback and will be available tomorrow on sdtimes.com. All registrants will receive an email directing them to the recording. Now on to today's program. As we've been reporting in SD Times, the convergence of organizational needs to interact with customers differently and the ability to give business side workers the tools they need to achieve that has brought us to a critical moment in the evolution of low-code solutions. Here to discuss how to create better customer experiences with low-code software development are Charles Araujo. He's an industry analyst at Intellix. Charles is an internationally recognized authority on the digital experience and author of The Quantum Age of IT, Why Everything You Know About IT is About to Change. As principal analyst with Intellix, he writes, speaks, and advises organizations on how to navigate through this time of disruption. He's also the founder of the Institute for Digital Transformation and a sought-after keynote speaker. Also with us today is Mike Thompson. He's Vice President of Product Marketing for Kony's Quantum Application Development Platform business, and he's been with Kony for 4 years. Prior to Kony, Mike led the systems management business at SolarWinds, focused on monitoring applications, servers, virtualization, and storage. Mike has also led product management and product marketing teams for IBM, covering cloud management and automation, storage management, and high availability products. So now to get us started, here's Mike.
Thanks, Dave. Charlie and I are pretty excited about being here, talking about this really great topic. And I think it's very timely right now, kind of at the cusp of the low-code movement. So, Charlie, let's get started. Why don't you take it off on, from your perspective, really where are we and how do we get here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am too excited. I think this is an incredibly important topic. And just in case anyone is wondering, we are not really using slides. We are your slides, so to speak. We're going to have what we hope is a very lively conversation that kind of keeps you interested. So yeah, let's dive into this. Why I think we, kind of how did we get here? Well, the first thing is that this is a story that has been playing out for, I would say, decades. I come from enterprise IT. I ran technical operations for about $1 billion healthcare firm 20 some odd years ago. And even then we were grappling with these issues. We were toying with kind of two sides of the same coin, right? On the one hand, you had this idea of rapid application development platforms, and we went through multiple iterations of that, trying to find stuff that would help us develop more quickly and be more efficient and productive with it. And the other side of the coin, we've had things like Lotus Notes and Microsoft Access and these kinds of tools that were all about sort of democratizing, pushing the ability to create applications or to create automation outside of the IT organization in some way. And having been through this, I was a part of a whole bunch of projects standing these things up, and I've been part of a whole bunch of projects tearing them back down again because they just didn't ultimately kind of get us there. And so I think that there's been this ongoing need for this, an ongoing demand that is now sort of coming to a head, so to speak, in what I'm calling the low-code movement.
And what were some of the business drivers you think behind the reason people did start going to some of those tools like Lotus Notes or Microsoft Access? Like, it was clearly a driver. What were the businesses looking for out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been two sets of drivers really on kind of both sides of this. On the one hand, for the IT side, it's all, development resources. If you're a developer, you're an expensive resource. And there's always been, I mean, from the very beginning, there's always been more demand than the capabilities that we had to deliver to meet all that demand. So there's, I mean, I think from on the IT side, there's, how can we do more with what we've got, sort of a thing. But then on the other side, there's, it's, I think that there's this other driver as far as that I think goes back to sort of from my first experience. I joke that, my career started if a 10-year-old can have a career with a Commodore 64 and a screwdriver. And my parents gave me this thing and I was mesmerized by it. I was just, completely enamored by all you could do. And it literally, sent me on this entire course for my life of really trying to understand how I could leverage technology to solve problems, do cool things with it. Well, I think even your non-IT user, to a certain extent, has a similar experience. Once they get a taste of technology, especially if it works, if it actually is transformative in even a small way, then suddenly they want it more. They want more of it. They want to use it in all these different places. And so I think you see things like Lotus Notes and Access and SharePoint even, and a bunch of different of these kind of earlier generation, were those first steps of trying to respond to that need of allowing the non-technical user to start getting their hands on this and kind of create their own solutions. But they came with their own challenges and baggage.
So, I mean, I think that driver, I agree with you, has been there for a long time, right? That, as people at the edge of the business, really in the business part of it, see the possibility, they've been looking for tools to do that. And I think part of the point is those tools haven't always been that great, especially if you start thinking about, how it works across a big organization. So that's been there for a while. What's different this time? Like, why is low code now different from what we had, in the past?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that at the end, these efforts didn't really work. And again, I'm kind of looking at it from both perspectives, right? From on the rapid application development side of things, what we saw was it was sort of like the quick fix. It got us over this hump where we maybe in some narrow band were able to develop more effectively or more productively, but it came with like golden handcuffs, right? Where yes, we could do that more quickly, but only if we stayed within this very narrow band of what we could do with it. But for any large organization of any size, frankly, that's just not how the world has worked ever, frankly. I mean, like I said, I was running IT 20 years ago, and it was like that then, and let alone now, where it's even much more complex and much more involved. And so those sort of efforts just never worked from that side. And then on the other side, what we had is I was a part of these some of these Lotus Notes efforts particularly, and they were fabulous until they weren't, because you ended up having this massive creep of applications. And I remember I was working on this one project where we were deconstructing this Lotus Note space, and oh my gosh, the challenges around things like governance, right? We had data that in some cases mission critical data that was one of them was a financial service firm. It was used for their pricing of security trades, and it was sitting in a flipping Lotus Notes database with almost no protection. It was duplicated data, so there was no governance of making sure that we knew where that data was flowing. There was always duplication of efforts. It just became this nightmare of this kind of scope creep. And so organizations pretty quickly realized that was just a disaster waiting to happen. The hard part is that the user sort of got that taste, right? It's like, wait a minute, I can build this on my own, I can do this thing, and so pulling it back out has been quite a challenge. And that's why I think we're seeing this. We're sort of in this perfect good storm, so to speak, of the low code movement now, where all those needs are still there, and I think finally the technology and a few other things have caught up where we can finally deliver on this promise.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't take something away unless you can give them something else to replace it, and I think that's been the challenge in the past so far. So, do you think where we are today, like, what do you see going forward? Where would you put the low code space right now, and then sort of where does it go?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, it's still nascent. This is still the rising tide that's floating all boats. We're still at the early stages of this, but I'm often asked, well, what makes it different, right? If we've seen this movie a bunch of times, is this just another remake and it's the same sad ending? And I think I don't believe so. I think that this is in fact a different story, and really comes down to two reasons. Two words maybe: abstraction and governance. And I'll tackle the first one. Abstraction is really this fact that what has limited this in the past has been that we haven't had the technology underpinnings to actually make this stuff work in the way that we sort of promised, right? It was in these very narrow bands, and it had to be very carefully constrained in order to produce the sort of experience that we were kind of talking about. What I think has happened in the last decade or so is that we've seen the evolution of web technologies overall. We've also seen the evolution of new development frameworks that are much more modular, much more flexible, much more dynamic. We've seen the rise of some people call it the API economy, but just this whole idea of RESTful APIs that now make the ability to interconnect systems much more transparent. and much more simple to do. We're seeing the rise of things like microservices, which allow us to start compartmentalizing things. And the net of all of that is it allows us now to actually create an authentic abstraction layer where we can create this simple interface that does allow for both the rapid development and, to whatever degree makes sense, the quote unquote citizen development or democratizing some of that, but still do it in a way that is controlled, manageable, and flexible. And I think that's the big shift. And I just, and this is where I'm not trying to slam any of the older technologies. The technology just wasn't there yet, right? It's just been this evolution that has led us to this point that now brings this, to the fold where we can actually do this for real.
Like anything, it's a confluence of a bunch of things happening, APIs, microservices, maybe more flexible platforms that bring us there. Maybe talk a little bit more about governance and how that, feeds in. I think the abstraction one, makes sense as far as we're pulling a bunch of those pieces together, but maybe say a little bit more about the governance part of what you mentioned up front.
Yeah, well, so because it's not just about the technology. I think the other thing is that organizations like yours kind of got the memo, right? You heard from folks like me going, hey, this is great, democratizing or making it easier to develop is wonderful, but we don't operate, when we were working in an enterprise, we don't operate in a vacuum. We don't have the flexibility to just go and throw it out willy-nilly. We have to have a degree of control and governance. And so I think that organizations like yours have now baked into these tools this, whatever we're going to call it, a management layer, a governance layer, this ability to now create that freedom, to create that flexibility, but to still do it with an eye on the enterprise needs of security, privacy, governance, management, role-based security elements where we can control, where you can only have access to what, and having it all pre-prescribed and managed in a way that makes it sustainable. And I think, because that's a big issue, right? I mean, it's not just about having the control, it's about making it sustainable. I'm old enough to remember, I actually ran a project as a consultant right after I'd left the healthcare company I was working for. And I had an entire team rolling around and having to manually change IP addresses on like 10,000 devices, right? Because we hadn't built this management layer. And so any change became this monstrosity of an effort. And that's sort of the same story we've had here, right? And so what has happened now with the modern low-code platforms like yours is that we've identified that these are gaps and these become barriers to sustaining these types of new delivery models. And so you now have baked in these tools that allow that to work. And so, that's why I think, when you put those two together, this now becomes a whole different game.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really why, to your point, it failed initially, is you didn't really have those things, or if you had them, they were really difficult, right? It wasn't easy to do, and that kind of took away all the value of moving things, farther out, maybe to the edge, closer to the business, where, what you really have to do is have those pieces, but bake them in, a little tighter.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. And what I think is interesting though about that is that I think those are sort of the new table stakes, but there's more to this, that things, that's still sort of solving the problems of the past, and we sort of have a whole new set of problems today that we have to attack as well.
Yeah, so then it goes back to the question I started a couple minutes ago, like, where are we going, right? So that's kind of where we've gotten to, which is great. I think it opens up a bunch of new doors, but yeah, maybe talk a little bit about, what's missing, from where we are right now and where we go from here.
Yeah, well, I think there's two pieces of this. The first is that all that is still true, all that has been true for a long time, but in the last, 5 or 10 years, we've also seen this much more fundamental shift. And that is that, the digital era, there's a bunch of different terms, but we're now in this period of time in which the kind of plodding way that we used to work, where we had lots of time, or at least more time, is sort of gone away. And now there is a tremendous amount of need around agility and speed to market and flexibility. I mean, I remember when I was running IT, we would have these conversations about, hey, I need to get this done or whatever. And we'd end up having these meetings where it was really about whether or not we would do it, because, it reached the priority level, so to speak. Today, those sort of conversations aren't happening as much because everything has to get done, right? The imperative, the customer is driving so much of a demand that you can't get away with not automating around the edges, with not creating applications that transform things. And so there's now the demand, well, it was always there. I think it's now just completely accelerated. And so it has really kind of put the pressure on this, that sort of led us to this point. But I think part of the challenge is still that people are still maybe taking too narrow a view of what low code's all about, that they're still looking at it in that kind of the band of, hey, it's all about automating and about efficiency and optimization, which it is all of those things. But I think the fun part about this is that there's maybe this one piece that's missing that people aren't even recognizing its true power of what's coming.
Yeah, and you know, we see the same. That really the definition right now is too narrow. So you know, that ability to really impact more than just, as you said, efficiency and effectiveness, but really going out to a customer experience opens up a lot more doors from kind of the narrower definition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think you're completely right, and you know, it's funny. I've been talking. So I gave a speech 5 years ago in New Zealand, and it was the first time I started talking about digital transformation. And as I was mentioning to you before we went on live, I was the #2 trending topic in all of New Zealand for like 15 minutes. And you know, it's New Zealand, so no offense to New Zealand people, but it's just not that big of a place. But nevertheless, it talked about how fresh this idea was, that nobody was really talking about it. And yet today it's now everywhere. And the irony is that I think most people have missed the real meaning of it, right? Digital transformation has less to do with technology or technology transformation. It's much more about business model transformation. And in fact, I would argue that it's really about the shift in power away from the organization to the customer, where the customer experience actually is what is now the chief driver of business value as we move into this kind of new time. And what is interesting and challenging about that is if you look at the technology stack that most enterprises and organizations have to work with, they have very, very few tools that are actually helpful to help them transform that experience. And so that is in fact what I think is the sort of missing link, or the part that people are missing about low code. But I think we're going to be looking back on this and say that was really the breakthrough, that yes, the optimization and efficiency was great and closing backlog, awesome, but it was the ability to use it to transform the customer experience that starts to change the game for organizations.
Yeah, I mean, we see that, and I think it's backed up by some of the analyst research we've seen as well. A lot of people almost think they're doing digital transformation. I think if you go out to CIO, most of them would say, yeah, we've got some kind of digital transformation initiative. But if you really look underneath that, what that means, I think a lot of the times it's just a broader scope of, you know, optimization of their current processes, you know, which you know, I don't think is really going to change the game for a lot of companies. Whereas there's a few that really are getting down to, like, how do I, you know, address my fundamental business models, right, and attack that. And you can't really do that without, you know, changing how you address the customer experience. That just has to be, you know, a richer customer experience.
Yeah, no question. It has to be a richer customer experience, and the hard part is that really requires kind of a shift in imagination, right? Where you're starting to think through or rethink, what does that even look like? And you know, in truth, the reason most people haven't done a great job of doing that is because it's hard, and especially because we now need to automate it. It's not just enough to transform the experience in sort of an analog fashion. You have to transform that experience digitally, and if you do have a business model that requires the kind of physical elements of it, you have to integrate those two together. Those are really, really challenging things to do, and especially because of the technology and the historical way we've developed code, it was a very long, arduous process, right? And so I think what's been interesting, and why I'm such a, you know, why I'm so bullish on the fact that low code is going to become this engine of customer experience transformation, is that it starts to change the way we even approach it. Because now suddenly we can put these tools in the hands of people closer to the point at which that experience is happening, and give them the flexibility to, if not outright create this, to participate in it much more intimately. And I think when you start doing that, and when you start tearing away these historical barriers we've had to the way we develop code, the way we create applications, the way we manifest an experience, and you tear that away and you give the people the tools to kind of stop worrying about the technology, then magical things start happening, and they start, you know, really seeing a different side of it. And I think it's really fascinating. And in fact, if I'd actually love to kind of turn this around on you a little bit, because as an industry analyst, for good or for bad, I get to kind of talk about these macro trends and see things from this perspective. But you and the Kony team, you guys are in the trenches. You're living this every day with your clients as they're actually doing this. And I think that there's some interesting stories to be had. I know I've had the privilege of hearing some of them. So maybe you can share some examples of what you and your customers are doing and how it relates to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I'd love to. Exactly what you talk about. A lot of these customers that we think are really seeing the success have kind of pushed that app development as close to the customer as they could. So they really are with teams that are really understanding it, right, farther out to the edge, while still kind of keeping the IT team, part of that equation. So you don't lose the governance and some of those other things that caused the problems before. But one great example of the governance piece is Amway. So I think a lot of people have heard of Amway. They operate, maybe people don't know how global they are, but they operate, in dozens of countries around the world. And what they were seeing was that every country viewed, providing a good customer experience via applications out to their users, but they all were doing it individually. So it was very inefficient. And to your point, the governance of that, when you have, essentially 15 versions of the same, basic application, it doesn't use your resources very well. It's really difficult to maintain, et cetera. So they moved everybody onto our platform, which let them sort of have an architecture and a framework for those things you talked about, governance and security, component reuse. How do you build a micro app? How do you share a micro app? All those type of things. And then how do you build from that low code paradigm? And that really changed it. Where with a little bit of governance, so it wasn't all technology. The company really did a great job of kind of putting together the center of excellence, and then working with the different countries to kind of pull them into the approach. And as you'd expect, there's a lot of reluctance, I think, at first. But as they start to see the benefit, like, okay, India's going to build this part, and Korea's going to build this part, and Ireland's going to build this part, and you have sort of a standardized way to do it. I think the numbers we heard from them were that they actually cut their development costs almost in half, as well as having applications that were probably going to be a lot easier to maintain and live with going forward. So I think that was a really great example of them taking the technology and then using it the right way, with the combination of kind of people and process on top of it to really get a great result.
So I know you have a couple more examples, but I want to kind of drill down on a couple little points here. So the first is, sort of shame on me, because we're talking about this up to this point in almost in this linear fashion. It's like, okay, well, low code is good for optimization efficiency, but hey, there's this next level, and that's really where you should be. And what you described actually is not that. It's not this kind of dualistic either or one or the. It's really all of the above. It's that they were simultaneously able to use this to not only get that optimization and efficiency, but also to improve the customer experience overall and to create a more unified experience across all their different properties and where they're operating. But then I would argue there's even one more piece of this, and that is, and having spent all my career really in large enterprises, this is a real significant issue of using it as a tool almost to bring these different divisions together and to, and I'm going to read between the lines here, but that's going to help solve some of the political drama that happens underneath the covers, because these teams are now seeing that they're dealing with some of the same issues and they're not actually, all different. And so, I think that's where people sort of, maybe don't give enough value to what this starts doing.
Yeah, exactly. So, and once you start seeing that value, it just kind of spreads. So I think they've, as they've had success breeds success, and
right.
It's easy to kind of break down some of those walls. And I'm sure they're getting kind of more optimized output when you're pulling, best ideas from, multiple different, regions or countries together to produce your app. So I think the other one I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about that we find really interesting is some of the work that Michaels. So in North America, people know Michaels as a arts and crafts retailer. I don't know if the people out other parts of the world know them as well, but they've been really, I think, focused on that customer experience. And one of the things I love is that it's not just one unified customer. They really are thinking about different personas. And And as a customer myself, you can kind of see two different types. I mean, there are people that are passionate about their projects and art and crafts and being creative with things, and they're in Michaels all the time. They are on the app. They want to get ideas and do that type of thing. So they've really got a view of how do I make that experience for that user better and richer and easier. At the same time, I'm probably more of the dad that has to go at 9 o'clock at night and get a poster board for my daughter's school project, and really I just want to find what I need, get in and get back home, and they've done kind of both, and really leveraging technology in a seamless way to do that. So a lot of it is just the base UI UX you can get with a native app. They've really leveraged that capability, because you can't have it look bad, right, if you're in that business. But using things like wayfinding and geolocation, so that within a store it knows which store is your store, and then how you would what shelf the item you're looking for is on. You can get a project and download all the things you need and get there right away. At the same time, catering to more of the creative types, where you can use artificial intelligence and natural language processing or chatbots to just tell it what you want. Like, I'd like to create a project using clay, whatever it is, and it uses that AI behind it to give you an intelligent view. Is that a project they're looking for? Would they like to see a video? Those type of things that is really trying to not create an artificial experience, but really align with the experience that those different personas have as they try to do it. And having the technology of chatbots and augmented reality and visual recognition and all those kind of things applied kind of in a seamless way to create an experience that matches what those personas are looking for. So I really like the way they're kind of pushing the boundaries, and really they're looking at even more things that they can add to that application.
Well, and what I love about that is that one of the things that I say all the time is that the reason I say this is a shift in power is that it represents kind of fundamental paradigm shift, right? Historic, and this goes also to the optimization versus experiential use of low code, right? Because historically, if we were talking about business process automation or optimizing a business process, well, we controlled that process. We knew exactly what the steps were. We could design it any way we wanted, and then build a piece of software that's out on top of that to automate it. When it comes to this customer experience, like what you just described, we lose control of that, because it's the customer who decides what experience they want and how they want that to play out. And we need to have enough flexibility to create and curate that experience in whatever way that is. And so what I love about the story about Michaels is doing is they're kind of opening that door and saying, okay, you can engage with us any way you want. But that's really hard to do from a technology perspective. And so you need that sort of flexibility. And I know a little bit about the Michaels story. I talked to some of their folks, I think, but I'm going to guess that this wasn't like, hey, they got it right out the gate, right? It's this iterative process, because you put it out there and you see how customers respond and react, and then you change it and you adapt. And doing that in a traditional development mechanism, incredibly hard, incredibly expensive. And so, again, why I think low code starts changing the game dramatically in this type of a conversation.
Yeah, and what we really like working with them is, like, we're kind of giving them the palette for them in sort of an art analogy to work from, and they can kind of decide like what technology is going to work for what they're doing. But the technology is not the limitation, right? It's really what's the right customer experience and how do you deliver that, as opposed to feeling like, yeah, I can't do that because that technology is too difficult or too hard to get to. So really, using that to adjust the customer experience. And then the third one I'll talk just briefly about is it's a smaller company. Those were two pretty large companies that, in Amway and Michaels, but it can be as small as just in the Netherlands, we've got a small consultant that's trying to deliver field service apps for retail customers. And really what they needed in low code, I think, is another core thing we don't talk about, but kind of the omni-channel experience, be able to quickly put out whether it be a native app, an iOS or Android app, or a web app, and even going to progressive web apps now, if people are familiar with that kind of web technology, that lets you match the use case. Like, some people are going to want to do things on a desktop. They're in the office, the desktop's the right form factor. Others are out in trucks or mobile, and really they need that mobile experience that's seamless, quick, performing, all those kind of things. And the ability to, I think one of the things that they really drive from the platform is the ability to build a component or a capability one time and deploy it to whatever form factor they're looking for. So, another great example of how do you get a solution that matches what the customer needs to get their
well,
right.
And what I love about that is it hits on another issue that I think that, again, I don't know what it is about us as IT people. We love to identify something, try to put a box around it and tie a bow on it and say, okay, that's what it is. But even the customer used the term omnichannel, and I think most people have approached omnichannel. A, they've limited it to this idea that it's retail oriented, and B, I would argue that they mostly described it in terms that are multi-channel, right? Omnichannel simply means but true omnichannel is experiential. It has nothing to do with retail. It has to do with the fact that as any customer, I want to, again, goes back to the same thing. I want to be able to engage with you on my terms, when I want, how I want, where I want. And your job is to deliver that mechanism to me so that I can do that. And by the way, have that experience be integrated, even if I change channels midstream, right? And again, from a technology perspective, insanely difficult, but that's what you have to get to. And again, I think that it's tools like yours that start making that possible for us to actually create the true essence of this omni-channel experience. And so, I think these are really cool examples. And what I love about them is that they're sort of like three different views of this sort of reimagining of the experience and what happens and what's possible when you do that. And I think you can kind of sum it up a little bit into, what does that mean? And you guys have a kind of a catchphrase that you're using to try to embody this, right? So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we think it really applies. What we're talking about here is low code without limits. So, I think most people on this webinar probably get the low code part, right? It's about, kind of the ability to go fast. That's the first thing we put in there. But also the ability to, scale easily, innovate freely and experience better. So we kind of think of those four capabilities that we're trying to deliver to our customers. Again, like I said, the first one, go fast. That's the core premise, I think, of low code, the ability to do that. And that can mean, quicker by, single project that applies across channels, visual, app development, all those kind of things. But the without limits, I think, is the part, a lot of what we're talking about in the next phase that we see coming up. And that's, the ability to scale easily. And we don't just mean more users, but scale in the types of things you can do. So a lot of times these have been thought of as fairly simple, B2E internal apps and used that way because of the limits on the customer experience that people have, that it isn't always the best customer experience with some of the things that are a little bit more constrained, and making sure that we're providing those tools to build full-on B2C apps, but still keep the speed of low code as you do that. And then innovate freely. Again, the Michaels example, one aspect I think of innovation that's key with low code that you get kind of with all the low code platforms is the ability to iterate quickly. If you push it out to the edges of your organization, closer to the customer, you make it so that anybody can kind of do these things and iterate, that is innovation, because you can try different things quickly and see how they work. I mean, that's really a better way to do it than the traditional move it into IT and create a project and 9 months later you get something out. But beyond that, kind of in the Michaels example, having this palette of things you can do, customer experience to, be free to do the type of things that you'd like to do. If you want to use a chatbot or augmented reality or, a lot of those geolocation, that those are things that are, really readily available in the platform. You don't have to necessarily go deep into the underlying technologies or decide which vendors to pick. We've kind of abstracted those pieces away. So that all you have to do is worry about what user experience you're trying to output. And I think that's really our view of innovate freely. Then finally, experience better. I mean, we've talked a lot about customer experience, which is kind of at the core of that, right? In the end, it's what the customer does. But, we take that a little bit more broadly. It's what's the developer experience as you do it. I think that's really crucial. And then, even more so, maybe what's the business experience? Are you getting kind of business results? Are you able to try new business models? Those type of things that really let you expand, the scope of what you can do.
Well, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would argue that there's also other, because I agree, it's experiences. The customer experience is the most important because that's the point at which the rubber meets the road, so to speak. but there's all these underpinning experience that lead up to it, right? So there's the employee experience, the partner experience, as you said, the internal consumer experience from a business perspective, and the developer experience, and they all need to work. And I think what's interesting about, as you guys are going down this road, is that it's about how do you improve across all those dimensions. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. If you fail on one of those, then it really doesn't. It makes it so it's hard to pull together the end experience you're looking for your customers.
So now I'm curious, being the jaded enterprise IT guy that I'll always be at my heart, we hear all the marketing pitches, right? What makes this more than marketing from your standpoint, right? How is this more than just, kind of marketing jargon without limits? I get it, right? What makes this real and tangible from your perspective?
Well, I mean, it gets down to, you hate to go too deep in the feature functions, but some of the things you talked about around governance, for example, like how do you make that easy? Like how do you make security easy? Security is especially if you're in a mobile environment, mobile security is a pretty complex thing. So, just an example there, we bake that all in so that you don't need a security architect. We've kind of done all of the work, and you can literally just click a checkbox to enable, almost like a dozen different security protocols, things like, white box cryptography and obfuscation and, all these other things that, a citizen developer doesn't want to know and probably you wouldn't expect to know and be able to apply right. So how do you make that easy? On top of kind of the visual drag and drop, there's, baking in a lot of those things that keep things from going badly, but make it easy for the end user. Things like, giving them native experiences, which it takes a little bit more effort to, build once with in our case, JavaScript is really the language if you have to go into kind of the low code aspect, but then be able to deploy natively to iOS and Android. So a lot of those pieces we think are different, but are core to what lets us give it an experience that's maybe different from some of the other low code platforms out there.
And I think one other thing that I want to drill down that we've sort of skirted around a couple of different times, and you mentioned it when you're talking about the Amway example, and that is that when we talk about low code in particular, when we talk about everything we've been talking about on this conversation, is that there's really two parts to this. It's those, whatever we want to call them, the citizen developers, the business users, the non-technical users that are out there closest to the point of experience that kind of know what they want. And then you have the professional developers, the historical place at which we've done all this work within IT. And really it's about bringing this together and having more, and part of it without limits, you just said it, right? A citizen developer wants only to do the parts that they understand, they know about, they care about. They don't care about all the stuff behind the scenes, but IT, who represents the entire enterprise, has to get that done. And so to me, part of the without limits story is about that sort of layering, right? Of allowing people to focus on the parts that they need to be focused on without worrying about the stuff that they don't. And so talk just a little bit more about how you help bridge that gap for organizations.
Yeah, I think it's a really key point. And that's a lot of the issue with low code is, your goal really is to move it out to the edges of your organization, people closest to your customer, right? In those business units. But that's typically going to be lower skills. You're not going to have your, senior architects or your developers a lot of times out there. So you want to give them freedom to kind of express the functionality that they want in an app or in a solution, while still being able to pull in maybe the more experienced IT people for some of that more complex pieces, and making sure that both can work together to both push it towards the edge without making it something that's just not manageable or sustainable without some involvement from the IT people. And in many cases, that people closer to the edge can visualize what they want, but even with a low-code tool, you can kind of put in maybe a user interface, but they might say, hey, I need this more complex function, but at least now they can communicate it and they can see it and they can test it with their customers.
And then the one last sort of related question to that is again, you sort of, you hit on this early on in the Amway story, but you talked about how there was kind of this initial resistance. And I think it's most common on the kind of IT side when there's this maybe skepticism around it, right? So maybe you can go back to that example. How did they overcome that, or how did it, how did that evolve as far as that transition from, hey, I'm not sure about this, to, hey, wow, this is really, you know, kind of amazing thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to, you know, it is a mix of technology and people, right? So technology itself doesn't solve all those problems, but without the right underlying technology, it's hard for people to do it too. So I think Amway is a great example of really the management team there, you know, making a decision and working with the end customers to understand their needs, what they're trying to achieve. Kind of going back to your Lotus Notes example, you know, they knew they wanted something. If you took away the tool they had, but you didn't give them something else, you know, that's not a great solution. So, you know, I think they're able to, you know, understand what they want, make sure they felt like they could still get it, and then show them a way that's more efficient. And, you know, in the end, you know, if they're only doing a third of the work they had to before, but they're still getting the output, it means you can do 3 times as much. And once you start seeing that kind of success, and I think a better user experience, it starts to build momentum. You start with 1 or 2 countries, and then you can show how that worked with others. And again, success breeds success.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think, hey, look at Mike. I think that's great. I really love how you described, you know, so much of what we've been talking about here and what we've discussed about low code and kind of bringing it to life, right? You know, we talked today about really this journey, what led us here, what brought us to this point of why there's still not only the historical need for these types of solutions, but that in fact it's increasing and getting more critical, more important. And that, you know, low code is now finally, I think at this point, it's this, like I said, the sort of perfect storm that it's all coming together where it's now really helping solve these problems once and for all. You know, but we talked about that it's more than just solving that backlog problem or the optimization efficiency, and that the real thing, and I mean, if there's one thing that I would hope everyone takes away from this, it's to start re-looking at how you're deploying whether you're deploying low code already or you're thinking about it, to make sure that you don't leave out the customer experience or the ability to leverage these kind of platforms to transform the experience, because in the end, that may be the single greatest driver of value for this whole thing. And you gave I think, some great examples of, you know, both how your customers are doing this and they're kind of at the leading edge of that process, and also how you guys are doubling down on kind of this whole approach and the without limits kind of approach. So I think it's great stuff. And frankly, it actually left me kind of wondering if really that's the end of the story. I have a feeling in the not too distant future, we'll probably be back here having another conversation about how low code is actually maybe taking things even one step further and helping drive full-scale business model transformation. I don't think that's a big leap. But I guess that's going to have to be a conversation that waits for another day. So in the meantime, let me see if I can figure out how to get this thing working here. All right. In the meantime, if you, I would like to suggest that if you're interested in learning more about what Mike has shared, about what the Kony team is doing to help their customers achieve outcomes like what they described today, then you should go to www.kony.com/quantum to learn more and download Kony Quantum for free. And so before we turn this back to Dave, Mike, was there anything else you wanted to add kind of on that front?
No, really appreciate talking to you today, Charlie. It was a good conversation.
All right, Dave, with that, we're going to turn it back to you.
Absolutely. So again, I would invite our attendees, if they have any questions, now is the time to type it into the control panel, and we'll again get to as many as we can. So while they're doing that, I just wanted to throw a question out. I guess we'll start with Mike on this one. In listening to the presentation, I had the thought, do vendors and others in this segment do a disservice to low code by calling it citizen development? Doesn't that kind of pigeonhole it in a certain way, where other people talk about low code being good for developers to be able to just create things more quickly? So what do you think about that? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely different use cases. There are some things that are probably, you know, very simple use cases that truly, you know, can be done, you know, front to back with a citizen developer, and you know, really more no code than low code, I'd say, in those situations.
Right.
And it's not that those don't have value. I wouldn't, you know, state the fact that can be valuable to give those tools again to the people on the edge. What we see though is that a lot of times, if that's where you're stuck, you can't go beyond that. It really is a limit. You know, there's a lot of things that you might want to do that citizen developer really can't do or can't do well without at least some interaction with the IT team. So I think it's still a valid, example and a valid use case, but, if you really want to be able to go farther, you want to start there and be able to go beyond that to, maybe a broader range of capabilities and things that they can do to address, the customer experience.
Well, and if I can chime in on that, I think it's an interesting question because the idea of, I mean, I'm not even sure who coined the term citizen developer, but this idea is, as we talked about, of pushing the active development or parts of the active development as close to the point of experience as possible, or as close to the point of need as possible, I think is a critical juncture, right? It's a critical thing that has to happen because where we often have issues when it comes to development, it's a disconnect. And I'm not saying it's always IT's problem. In many cases, it's in fact the consumer of that application that can't actually articulate what it is they actually want. And so sometimes by putting that tool in front of them, giving the ability to start doing some of this manipulation themselves, it starts creating clarity. But the other thing I think it's really important is sort of implicit in that question, Dave, was this idea that maybe using low code isn't real development. And I would argue that development is not about coding, right? Development is about understanding what it is you're trying to achieve. It's about data models, it's about frameworks, it's about how do you architect an application to create the business outcomes you're trying to create. And whether you actually write the quote unquote code to do that or not, that's actually the big value add that a development team brings to the table, that your typical non-technical citizen developer has no idea. They can tell you what they want. They can maybe tell you how they want it to look, but they can't explain to you how it has to work on the back end to make that data flow the way that it needs to make that happen, to protect the integrity of that data, all of those things. And so that's the critical role that IT continues to play in this environment, whether it's coding or not. And so, to me, the whole idea of citizen development is just this idea of kind of splitting that up and empowering them to participate more fully in this process, which ultimately delivers better outcomes and speeds the process altogether.
Great. So are there any specific use cases that low code is a better fit for than others? Mike, maybe you take that.
You want me to start? I think traditionally it's been, aimed at more of these internal, like take a paper-based process and make it more efficient and optimize it, what we'd call a business to employee or BDE type application.
Right.
But I think that's the whole point is that there's value, again, similar to the discussion about a system developer and pushing it out, but there's a lot of things that have a lot of value that you can't do if you're stuck just with things behind the firewall or just a web-based app that doesn't maybe have the best UX or user experience that you'd want to put out to your customer. So I think that's probably the traditional one is more of those internal workflow type things. But again, I think there's a lot of opportunity coming up for businesses if you can get beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is no. They're all, I mean, almost every use case you can imagine today. People have talked a lot about cloud first. I think we largely in the enterprise should be talking about low code first, right? Be asking yourself, can I create this more efficiently, more quickly, more robustly with a better experience using low code platforms versus hand coding? And I know that probably runs somewhat antithetical to what some current thought processes are, even especially with the whole DevOps movement and whatever. But I wrote an article for CIO Magazine about a year and a half ago, and it was titled something to the effect of, are we seeing the end of coding in the enterprise? And I don't know that it's universally true, but increasingly with platforms like Kony that are getting ever more powerful and flexible, the number of things you cannot do in these platforms is rapidly falling. And so I think it's really about breaking out of the inertia. This is how we've always done things, and starting to recognize that it does give you a ton of flexibility. It doesn't really limit you for the most. I mean, there's always trade-offs, right? But it gives you, I think it's a trade-off worth making, and increasingly you can insert them into CI/CD pipelines and DevOps methodologies. And so there's really very few use cases that I would come across right now where I would say absolutely you can't use low code to at least explore that. So, I think it's an interesting point in time that we're at.
Yeah. So how does that work with like a DevOps process? How does the low code fit in with that?
I mean, I think Charlie hit it pretty well. It fits in just fine. I think that integration, again, you're about speed is core to low code, and putting it into sort of an automated DevOps process where you have, source code check-in, automation across all those, across CI/CD, automated testing, all those kind of things get you the best of both worlds, where you get automation, you get speed, but you don't lose the quality of sort of a structured development process.
And for non-developers, that all happens behind the scenes.
Exactly. That's a lot of times would be set up by a development team that says, okay, here's the process I want it to flow through, and then can become pretty close to invisible to a front end citizen developer type person.
I mean, I think speaking agnostically for a second, the challenge has been that the DevOps pipelines, there are the CI/CD pieces that we've talked about historically, were built for hand coding, right? That's what they conceptualized, and so that's historically been the breakdown. I think you're seeing two things. One is the low-code players have recognized this, that if they want to play in the enterprise space, they have to be able to be incorporated into CI/CD pipelines to be able to operate in a DevOps type approach, and so they've been building those. Right? They've been building those bridges into the traditional CI/CD pipeline tools. And then secondarily, I think we're also starting to see recognition within those traditional tools that that this is existing, and so they're starting to building those connectors. And so I think it's becoming easier and easier as time goes on.
Phenomenal. So here's a good question. Someone wants to know if they had to reorient their organization around customer experience, that would be a very big change for them, and they're just curious to know if a low-code platform can help with the cultural change aspect as much as the development side of things.
Yeah, I'll dive in first, mostly because I've spent a good chunk right before I started this crazy part of my career where I'm traveling around speaking. I spent about the last 5 or 6 years before that, mostly running these large organizational change transformational programs. And when we talk about this, it is fundamentally about organization. It's about culture. It's about breaking through that inertia. And what we increasingly found is that it was actually the artifacts that drug people back. That you could talk about it and you could have these meetings and people would get it, and then they went back to their day-to-day work, and that work actually forced them into, so to speak, the traditional way of doing things. Into it's why not to get off topic here, but when we talk about agile and where it's worked and where it hasn't in the enterprise, well, a lot of times we see agile as nothing more than fast waterfall. And why? Because the tools that are used were all built for waterfall methodologies, and so it was really hard to adapt them until you start replacing them. And so one of the things I think is really fascinating about what low code does is low code actually becomes, in my opinion, an enabler for this sort of organizational change into the shift towards the experience, because it fundamentally uproots the nature of the development process itself. And so it sort of takes away those artifacts that would have historically held us into these traditional approaches, and therefore becomes, in my opinion, an enabler of change. And I think the story might be shared with Amway, not to keep harping on them, but the story you shared about Amway is a classic case of that, where suddenly this tool became a bridge.
And I'll add to that, as you push this out to the edge are the business users, right? And they have a different perspective on what they care about as an outcome. It has to have a business result. A lot of times projects, if you're trying to make a cultural change, it's a little more abstract. If you're an IT or a central, part of the organization that's farther away from those end business results. So a lot of times they can really point to, business drivers or business results from initial pilots or, MVP type projects that let them push these through and say, hey, this has to happen. This is the change we need because we're seeing business results. So again, kind of an artifact of moving it close to the edge. You're to some extent changing the power balance within an organization and letting them kind of be more of an advocate for those solutions.
Yeah. Again, not to get off track, but that's a really excellent point. I think a lot of managers very much understand, okay, we need to bring in a new tool. We'll learn how the tool works. But I think really lack skills to drive a cultural change, which seems to be why in every conversation you hear about things like digital transformation, first they outline all the steps technologically you need to take, and then at the end they kind of throw in, and it'll involve a little cultural change, which of course is never a little change.
That says that a miracle occurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think having a tool that can actually help that is really great. Okay. So I think we have time for one other quick question, and that came in from someone. So is low-code solutions, are they typically cloud-based or on-prem, or what's the benefit of one over another?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like the rest of the world, typically they are pretty cloud-based. You know, there's all the advantages of cloud, you know, automatic updates, you're accessible from anywhere you want. You got, you know, the ability to take advantage of the kind of infinite scaling from an infrastructure point of view. So, you know, that I think is the most common by far would be cloud-based. But there are people that, for various reasons, you know, security or other reasons, you know, do want to bring it on-prem. So both are possible, but definitely I think, you know, cloud, you know, has advantages as you're moving forward. You know, low code's a new paradigm. It's kind of like why would you go back, you know, in time, so to speak, and not marry it with cloud unless you really had to. So yeah, I think cloud's the way to go if you can.
Great. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Mike Thompson, Charles Araujo, great conversation on low code. And of course, I would like to thank Coney, who sponsored this event here today, and thank all our attendees for hanging in there with us. So until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times. So long for now.